Thank you. Dr. Cook is a research assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. His research focus is understanding and countering misinformation about climate change, with an emphasis on using critical thinking to build resilience. He founded Skeptical Science, authored the book Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, and developed the smartphone game Cranky Uncle, combining climate science, critical thinking, and cartoons to explain and counter climate misinformation. He also co-authored the college textbooks Climate Change, Examining the Facts, and Climate Change Science, A Modern Synthesis, and the book Climate Change Denial, Heads in the Sand. The title of his talk today is Combining Psychology, Critical Thinking, and Gamification to Counter Science Misinformation. Very much looking forward to your talk, and I want to thank you for being the first speaker of our spring series. And so I will turn it over to you, Dr. Cook.
Thanks, Julie. I will share my slides now. Hopefully they're coming up okay for everybody.
Yes, perfect.
So firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to talk. I only just, I guess over the last few weeks since we started corresponding, or the last few months, become aware of the term cyber psychology. And it reminded me a lot of the term technocognition, which my PhD supervisor, Stefan Lewandowski, coined at a psychology conference in Sydney a number of years ago. And the idea being we were grappling with the problem of misinformation being such a complex societal issue, and there was no one discipline that could solve the problem because it had penetrated all aspects of society, and it was a problem from a psychological perspective, from technology, social and cultural. And so we were musing on how solutions to misinformation need to be interdisciplinary, and in particular, combining psychology and technology in different solutions that can be scaled up to take on the problem in large scale ways. And it was at that point that Steve just came up with the term technocognition, which we thought was clever at the time. Although I think I actually maybe prefer cyber psychology, and I'm going to have a chat to Steve about that and what he thinks. So what I'm going to talk about today is the research I've been doing, and my discipline is psychology, and that's really been the main focus of almost all of my work up till this point. But over the last couple of years, I've become increasingly interested in trying to combine my research findings from psychology with other disciplines. And that's led me to firstly working with philosophers on critical thinking solutions, but more recently working with game developers to come up with a gamification solution to misinformation. So I'm going to start by talking about the psychology research, but then how that transitioned into this more cyber psychology or technocognition solution. So firstly, I wanted to kind of diagnose the problem. Like, in order to solve the problem of misinformation, we need to understand how misinformation does damage. Like, what is the problem in the first place, and therefore how can we solve it? And misinformation does damage society in a number of different ways. It causes people to believe wrong things. It has a polarizing effect. It reduces trust in scientific institutions or governments, or just mainstream institutions in general. But I want to talk about one particular experiment that was run by Sander van der Linden and some of my colleagues at Mason and at Yale, who explored what happens when people are exposed to not just misinformation, but conflicting pieces of information. And so in their experiment, they showed people a couple of different messages. One message was the 97% scientific consensus amongst climate experts that humans are causing global warming, which has been found in a number of different studies. Secondly, they also showed people some misinformation that cast doubt on the scientific consensus on climate change. And this screen here is taken verbatim from a website called the Global Warming Petition Project. And the purpose of this website is to cast doubt on the scientific consensus on climate change. And the way it does that is it lists 31,000 Americans who have completed a science degree and also signed a statement saying that humans aren't disrupting climate. This is what happened when people were shown either one or the other pieces of information or both. The first column here shows people who were just shown the 97% consensus. And the y-axis in this graph is a change in their perceived consensus, what they thought the scientific consensus was. And as we see, there's a strong positive effect if people are told that there's 97% consensus, because many people aren't even aware of that. And so you see a huge shift, 20% increase in perceived consensus. But when people were shown just the misinformation, it had a strong negative effect. It reduced perceived consensus by 10%. So that shows what I alluded to before, that misinformation does have this negative impact in misinforming people, causing them to either believe wrong things or believe accurate things less. But the third column here is people who were shown both the fact and the misinformation. And what we see here is the two cancel each other out. And this is a case where a result that's statistically insignificant, actually highly significant, because what this tells us is when people are presented with conflicting pieces of information and they don't know how to resolve that conflict, cancel each other out. It's a bit like those old Star Trek episodes where Captain Kirk gets cloned and Mr. Spock has to work out which is the real Kirk and which is the fake Kirk. That's the conundrum that the public face when there's all this conflicting information flying around on mainstream media, on social media, everywhere. And so if they can't tell, well, which is the facts and which is the fake news, then the risk is that they disengage and they just believe neither. And so the consequences of this is that misinformation doesn't even need to be convincing or based on arguments or logic or evidence. It just needs to exist, and that can cancel out facts. It can cancel out accurate information. And so to try to address this problem, Sander van der Linden in this experiment attempted to neutralize the misinformation. And to do this, they drew on a branch of psychological research called inoculation theory. This basically takes the idea of vaccination and applies it to knowledge. You can build people's immunity or their resilience or their resistance against misinformation by exposing them to a weakened form of misinformation. And by weakened form of misinformation, I basically mean explaining to people how that misinformation distorts the facts or misleads people. Here's an example of an excerpt from their inoculation message. Basically, it explained how the Global Warming Petition project was misleading, and it showed several ways in which it didn't paint an accurate picture. Firstly, it was an online petition, so anyone could sign up for it. And so you see a lot of fake names. There were Star Wars characters, there were Spice Girls, there were people who had been dead for many years whose names were on the list. Secondly, 31,000 seems like a lot of people, but it was 31,000 science graduates, and there are millions of science graduates. So it's actually a very small percentage of the actual pool of people who have completed a science degree. And thirdly, the survey was anyone who had completed a degree in any field of science. And it turns out over 99% of the signatories' degree was not relevant to climate science. There were people who had completed degrees in computer science, medical science, dentistry, mechanical engineering, but less than 1% of the signatories had any relevant expertise in climate science. What the researchers found was when people were shown this inoculating message before the misinformation, it mostly neutralized the misinformation, and it enabled the facts to have a positive effect. And so, in other words, what inoculations do is help people resolve that conflict between fact and myth. If there is if there's fact and then there's a myth that uses a technique of denial or a rhetorical technique or a logical fallacy, raising people's awareness of that fallacy can help them tell the difference between which is the misleading argument and which is the accurate information. Now, what I've been focusing on is different ways to actually inoculate people. Like the general principle, exposing people to a weakened form of misinformation, can be applied in a lot of different ways. So I've been testing different ways and testing them in lab experiments in order to work out psychologically what's happening under the hood and which are the most effective ways of inoculating. Sorry, let me jump back a little bit. So what I've focused on is logic-based inoculation. So that involves actually explaining the logical fallacies or the rhetorical techniques that are used in misinformation and explaining them in a general sense, just raising people's awareness of the different tricks that can be used to deceive people, and then that being the inoculating message. So the first inoculation experiment I did actually used that same misinformation about the global warming petition project. And I found that when you expose people to just the misinformation, just the same as in that previous experiment, it had a negative effect. It reduced their perceived consensus and their general acceptance of climate change. But the horizontal axis in this figure is political ideology. And what it shows is that climate misinformation doesn't affect everyone in the same way. The more politically conservative people are, the stronger the effect of the misinformation. So this means that climate misinformation has a polarizing effect. It pulls the public apart. So some people get affected more. And so if misinformation is out there flooding the media landscape and people are being exposed to it, that has the result of polarizing the public even further. Here is an excerpt of my inoculating message. And there was a big difference between my inoculation and the one in the previous experiment, in that I didn't mention the global warming petition project specifically at all. I intentionally tried to avoid mentioning a specific piece of misinformation. And instead, what I focused on was the technique, the main misleading technique in the misinformation, in this case, fake experts or argument from false authority. And I found that if you explained that fake expert technique and used an analogy, in this case, I used the tobacco industry, who used that technique back in the mid 20th century. I found that with this blue line here, it had overall had a neutralizing effect. There's a slight slope to the line, but statistically, this line is equivalent to 0. It's like a horizontal line across 0. And what this tells us is the inoculation, explaining that fake expert strategy, neutralized the misinformation across the political spectrum. Whether people are at the liberal end of the political spectrum or the conservative end, no one wants to be misled. So explaining the techniques used to mislead neutralizes those techniques. And so a lot of my work has focused on explaining the techniques used to mislead people. And I've drawn on a framework that was first developed by Mark Hufnagel, the 5 characteristics of science denial, which I summarize as an easy to remember acronym FLIC. And over the last decade, I've been building this landscape of science denial techniques. So it's now getting quite huge and I'm still adding to it. Just in the middle of 2020, when conspiracy theories were rampant about COVID-19, I added, working with Stefan Lewandowski, we added 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking to the FLIC taxonomy. And there's more planned to be added down the track. And I'll come back to this problem, the problem that there are so many techniques that people need to be aware of in order to be resilient against misinformation. So in my research, I've been testing different ways of explaining these techniques of science denial to the public. And let me quickly go through a few examples. One approach has been testing non-humorous critical thinking approaches versus humorous cartoon approaches to try to engage people and explain logical fallacies in a user-friendly, entertaining way. So here is an experiment we ran where the top part of it is a tweet showing some misinformation about climate change. And then underneath it is a reply tweet, which shows a debunking and an explaining of the fallacy in the misinformation. It's taking a critical thinking approach, looking at the structure of arguments. Every argument has its starting assumptions or premises leading to a conclusion. And by examining a claim's argument structure, you can identify where the misinformation commits a logical fallacy. So we found that we either showed people the non-humorous inoculation or correction. And we also tried a humorous correction. And this involved basically using cartoons to illustrate the logical fallacy in the argument. And specifically, this is a technique called parallel argumentation. Taking the flawed logic from the original misinformation and transplanting it into an absurd situation, but using that same logic in the absurd situation in order to make the logical flaw clearer. And so the argument here in this case being climate has changed naturally before, therefore what's happening now must be natural climate change as well, is exactly the same logic as saying people have died of natural causes before, so anyone who dies now must also have died of natural causes, even if it's clearly someone who was murdered, as in is the case here with a guy with a knife sticking out of his back. So the idea being, well, this is obviously ridiculous logic, but it's exactly the same logic as arguing past climate change shows or proves that current climate change is natural. Now, what we found with this humor versus non-humor approach, and I'll just explain it in general terms, is both approaches were effective in neutralizing the original misinformation. But the interesting thing was they were both effective in different ways. We used mediation analysis to analyze what was the pathway or the mediator that made the correction effective. Now, in the case of the non-humorous approach, this had higher credibility. And it was that high credibility that basically debunked the original myth or reduced the credibility of the original myth. In the case of a humorous approach, using eye tracking data, we found that people looked at the cartoon for longer. And it was this increased attention that reduced the credibility of the misinformation, or basically debunked the myth. And so different responses to misinformation, different types of inoculations can be effective, but through different pathways, whether it's through higher credibility or higher attention. The other thing we've looked at is inoculating people against misinformation, either by explaining facts or through this logic-based approach that I've been talking about. So you can inoculate people by explaining the facts to them so that they can see how the misinformation is wrong. So for example, you might explain how the greenhouse effect works, so that if they encounter a myth about the greenhouse effect, they can see where it's wrong because their understanding of how the greenhouse effect works is inconsistent with the myth. And so we ran an experiment. Both conditions were humor-based. So we're using either a cartoon explaining the facts or a cartoon explaining the logical fallacy. But in this case, the emphasis in these two different approaches was either on emphasizing the facts or emphasizing the logic. The fact-based correction explained, and we were debunking the myth that CO2 is plant foods. Plants need CO2 in order to grow, therefore emitting more CO2 will be good for plants. And the fact here is that plants need not just CO2, but a whole range of conditions in order to flourish. And therefore, emitting CO2 not only will be more fertilizer for plants, but it'll also cause climate change, which will disrupt plant growth. So the logical fallacy is oversimplification. It's not looking at the whole set of conditions that plants need to flourish. So we tested these two approaches, fact-based inoculations and logic-based, but we also tested the order in which people saw them, because we don't know how people are going to receive misinformation and facts out in the wild. They might see one first and the other. They may have already seen misinformation before we show them an inoculation, or they may not have. And so we tested what happens when they see these inoculations or corrections before versus after seeing misinformation. With a logic-based approach, it doesn't matter. Whether they see the logic-based correction before or after a myth, it's equally effective in neutralizing the misinformation. But the really interesting thing was the facts-based approach, its effectiveness depended on the order in which it was seen. If people saw a myth first, but then the last thing that they saw was the facts, then the facts were effective in neutralizing the misinformation. In other words, the last thing that people saw had the biggest effect. But if they were shown the fact-based correction first, and then the myth about CO2 being plant food was the last thing that they saw, then the myth was more effective. And so what this tells us is facts can be effective, but it kind of depends on the context in which people see them. And we can't really control that. We don't know what order people are seeing information or how they're seeing it, how they're being exposed. And so our facts are vulnerable when they go out into the wild. Logic-based corrections or just logical explanations are more robust because they give people the tools to be able to process information and be able to understand what they're looking at better. So, what we took from this research was that facts are important. We're not throwing facts under the bus, but we argue that facts need to be accompanied with critical thinking or logic-based explanations. And so let me just go back to that Flick taxonomy then. So if we need to build resilience by explaining denial techniques and logical fallacies, there is a lot for people to take in, and that's a big communication and education challenge. And for me as a communicator, researcher, and someone who does a lot of public engagement, trying to communicate all this through tweets is challenging, and trying to raise people's awareness of all the different definitions and examples. It's hard to do that through social media or even through mainstream media. And so that's where I think cyber psychology comes in combining this psychological research into inoculation and critical thinking, and seeing whether technology can offer solutions to be able to effectively educate people across this whole landscape of denial techniques. So having done nearly a decade of lab work exploring different ways to inoculate people, even kind of narrowing in on these effective ways of doing it, using critical thinking, using humor, and the logic-based inoculation approach, there were still three challenges that I had really no answer to in terms of actually implementing this in the real world. The first is psychological. As I was saying, like that big Flick taxonomy is a lot to take in. And just critical thinking in general is cognitively difficult. Our brains are built for what Daniel Kahneman calls fast thinking. We rely mostly on mental shortcuts or heuristics in order to just assess information. What our gut tells us, our instantaneous reaction, is often how we end up whether to believe information or how we receive it. And so getting people to do what Daniel Kahneman calls slow thinking, or reasoning through, trying to deconstruct arguments and apply critical thinking to see whether the argument is logically valid or not, that is a lot of effort, cognitive effort. And it's just hard for us to do it. It's not that we're necessarily lazy. It's just that that's how our brains are hardwired. The second challenge is structural. Even if I come up with the perfect inoculating message, how do I get that to communities who are the ones who are most hit by climate misinformation or any form of science misinformation? The way that the mainstream media is becoming more fractured and siloed, and social media even more so, where everyone's just receiving information that already conforms to what they believe. How do you penetrate into those different communities? And thirdly, when you have scientific issues that are polarized, that are controversial, like climate change, it gets to the point where people's the biggest driver of, for example, what people believe about climate change is political affiliation, who they vote for, or what social tribe they identify with. So when they encounter information that threatens their beliefs or their tribal identity, their social identity, they're less likely to accept or believe or even listen to that information, or even, you know, there are some, in some cases, they might even react by doubling down on their beliefs, and efforts to try to accurately inform people can actually backfire. So this is where I turned to gamification, or not even, I wouldn't say I turned to gamification. I started working on a game to teach critical thinking, and then along the way realized that this approach had the potential to answer all three of those challenges. Firstly, let me just explain how this works. So what this game does is it takes the approach of inoculation, but it makes it interactive, or what researchers call active inoculation. And so what the concept of the game is that you're being mentored by a science-denying cranky uncle on how to become a cranky uncle yourself. And so he explains to you the different techniques of science denial that he uses to reject the science. And as you play the game, you get crankier and crankier, and the goal being to become a cranky uncle. And so the way he does that is, firstly, he explains all the different science denial techniques. So he'll say, here is how to cherry pick. Here is anecdotal thinking, which is a form of cherry picking. And then he'll just go through and explain it. I use these examples, like I use parallel argument cartoon examples by taking the logic in a science myth and then transplanting it into an analogous situation, just to show that logical flaw. But then what happens after you've learned these science denial techniques is then you practice critical thinking. And this is where games are particularly powerful, because you can use all the tools of gameplay, earning points, leveling up, and hopefully down the track, competing with other people. All those gameplay tools can motivate people to continue practicing over and over again. And in this case, practicing critical thinking or identifying fallacies in examples of misinformation. So what the game does is it shows you examples of logical fallacies, and you have to identify which fallacy is in the example. And then you just repeat that. And what this is one of our main research questions now, as the game is out and we're starting to collect data. By measuring how long it takes people to answer these quiz questions, we can basically see whether people get quicker at identifying fallacies as they get further into the game. And if that happens, if they get quicker while maintaining accuracy, this is evidence that this kind of gameplay helps people turn that system to, that sort of slow thinking, critical thinking task, that really difficult, effortful task, it converts it into a fast thinking mental shortcut. Because by practicing over and over again, it becomes a much more quicker and effortless task. So that's I think one of the most exciting elements of using gamification to tackle misinformation, getting people to practice critical thinking. And it's basically replacing bad mental shortcuts or the heuristics that people apply, which makes them vulnerable to misinformation, and replacing it with good mental shortcuts or heuristics. The second challenge of trying to apply inoculation in the real world is structural. How do you reach all those siloed communities? And what I'm finding just through practical experience is coming up with an interactive, engaging game to teach critical thinking. Doors apply particular solution in classrooms. So just over the last few weeks, we've made available a teacher's guide to the Cranky Uncle game, which basically explains everything I've just covered in terms of inoculation and the scientific research informing the game, as well as a whole range of different classroom activity ideas. And just over the last 2 weeks, we've seen teachers sign up to use the game in their classrooms already across 51 different states. And it's red states and blue states. I mean, you have your coastal states, you have New York and California and Washington, but you also have Alabama, Texas, Utah, Kansas, and as I was developing the game, I was quite taken aback by just the enthusiasm that teachers had for interactive ways to engage their students and teach both the science and the critical thinking. So my sense is that educational resources like this are a powerful way of cracking that structural challenge. And the third challenge is social, that idea that polarized issues like climate change are tribal, and tribal thinking often results in these negative outcomes like a lack of progress on climate change or inability to be able to, I guess, tribal drivers can increase people's vulnerability to misinformation. And I had this sense that maybe a year or two down the track, as we developed the game and we were able to add contests into the game, particularly group versus group contests, there was the potential that the game could tap into tribal instincts, but in a way to motivate people to learn critical thinking. By one group competing against another group, they could, the group, in order to win a contest, they would have to get better at the game, get further into the game, and therefore build up their own resilience against misinformation. And so therefore that tribal instinct, which normally makes people vulnerable to climate misinformation, could actually be leveraged to build resilience against misinformation. That's the theory anyway. But what really surprised me was just over the last week, a town in Ohio said they want to challenge their nearby town to a cranky contest. And so they asked, is it possible to have like a code for their town and a code for the other town, and then add up the total number of cranky points that both towns accumulated, just to see who won over I think the month of April, or maybe it was April 1 to Earth Day, as a way of building resilience against climate misinformation just leading up to Earth Day. And this actually blew me away. Like, mainly I'm kind of embarrassed that the idea never even occurred to me, that such a simple idea, but it taps into that idea of tribal competitiveness, but as a motivator to build resilience against misinformation. And it's really that combination of technology and psychology that leads to these creative solutions. And I'm kind of really curious what other ideas people are going to come up with and how they might apply a game like this. So that's all I wanted to talk about now, but I'm happy to answer any more questions. And anyone interested in finding out more, firstly, you can email me if you want to ask me questions directly. You can find out more information about the game at crankyuncle.com. And you can also download the game both for Android and for iPhone from there. And I should also mention too that the game's development is based on donations. So any support or donations to help us continue to develop the game is welcome, and you can donate via the Cranky Uncle website. And lastly, on my YouTube channel, and the URL is there, I have a whole bunch of long videos going into much more detail into a lot of the principles that I just talked about, including inoculation and critical thinking. So you can check out those links there. I might quit sharing and then be happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Cook. Quite interesting. I enjoyed listening to that very much. Do we have any questions that folks could put into the chat for Dr. Cook? Go for it. If you could just put it in the chat, Myra.
While we're waiting for a question, I was interested, Julie, in your perspective on this work from a cyber psychology point of view, given that you've written a lot about that approach.
Oh, there's so much to say. I was really thinking about a lot of different ideas as you were speaking. I was thinking of how challenging it is really to facilitate and promote critical thinking, and what a tall order that is. And I was particularly struck by your use of, I've seen your videos before, which I really enjoy. It looks like you and some other researchers and maybe some actors. And I found your videos very compelling, but also the cartoons.
They weren't actors, by the way. They were all scientists at the university.
Okay. I wasn't quite sure. Well, they were good actors too, good scientists and good actors. So they have another career in the works, just in case the academia thing doesn't go through. But I'm just joking with that. But also the cartoons, your use of cartoons is very compelling. They're funny. They're engaging, and I wondered about that, your thoughts about sort of videos, real life people versus cartoons. And then the other thing, there are quite a number of students watching today and joining us, and they're from a variety of disciplines, engineering, computer science, in addition to psychology. And I think what your work really demonstrates is the interface of a number of disciplines. You certainly need cartoonists, you need specialists in communication, you need specialists in computer science, you need specialists in psychology. And I love that your work sort of brings all of that together in a really compelling kind of approach.
Yeah, there was a lot there. So I guess the first thing is one approach that I really like about the Center for Climate Change Communication here at George Mason University is their general philosophy is science communication as a team sport. And they really take that approach from Baruch Bischoff, who advocated that the most effective, I guess, combination for science or science communication or public engagement is bringing together content experts like climate scientists, social scientists like communication researchers and psychologists, and communication practitioners. And that's really important too. And generally that's people who are already kind of at the in the trenches, at the front line, engaging with the public. So the two examples of that we do at George Mason is, one is the Climate Matters program, where we work with TV meteorologists who are very skilled communicators already, but we provide the resources on climate change and how climate change impacts weather. And by giving them the resources and then their communication skills and their reach, being on TV, that enables us to get those resources out to millions of people. Another one now that we're concentrating on is the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, which is the same model, but in this case, health professionals are our communication practitioner. So health professionals are one of the most trusted voices in talking about the health impacts of climate change. And so we give those, that community resources. So yeah, it's fine. I think you do need to bring together the social scientists, the content experts, and in my case, game developers, and also a cartoonist, which happens to be me.
Oh, wow.
And you had to have all those things combined in order to create this kind of interdisciplinary project, and that's hard. Like, I find interdisciplinary projects really challenging because I don't know game development. Like, when I listen to the guys talking, it's just speaking another language, and I'm just trying to keep up. And it's the same when I work with the philosophers. They not only speak a different vocabulary, they just think in a different way to me. And
Absolutely.
But it's those kind of collaborations that really, I think, are the most effective type of solutions for actually solving complex problems.
Yes. So thank you. We have a number of questions here. So Miriam, and I'll combine two, although they're not necessarily exactly related. Miriam and Motion and David Romano, do you think it's a good idea to get little kids, 5th grade-ish, to start playing these games early on? And then how do you deal with the emotional connection to misinformation? They're two different, very interesting questions.
Yeah, I suffered from a real lack of imagination when I first conceived this game, and I've had to be flexible along the way right up to this week, because originally I thought of this as a college game, like that it would be useful in college classes. But then, as we were doing our pilot testing and finding it was showing an effective increase in critical thinking for college students. As a speculator, we also tried it with some senior high schoolers, and to my surprise, the result was almost identical. High schoolers showed the same levels of being able to spot fallacies as undergraduate college students. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe the game could work in high school as well as college. But then I started hearing reports of teachers using it all the way down to grade 6. And they're reporting that the students were responding really well to the game. We have yet to quantify how effective the game is at all different grade levels. But anecdotally, to my great surprise, the game seems to work from middle school all the way up to grad school. So my expectation is we will, through collecting all this data from grade 5 or 6 up, work out kind of a threshold where the effectiveness of the game starts to drop off. And at that point, I think what probably needs to happen is we then write a simpler, younger version of the game. And there's precedents for this. Sander van der Linden has developed several fake news games, including getbadnews.com. I think it's goviral.game is his game that debunks or teaches resilience against COVID misinformation. But definitely with the getbadnews.com game, he's got the adult version, but also a child version. And we expect that we'll probably have to go down a similar route and create a sort of a child version of Cranky Uncle. One of the comments I really liked from the college students was, in response to playing the game, was, it teaches us how to outsmart boomers.
Outsmart what?
Boomers. You know, the boomer generation.
Oh, boomers.
So there is that interesting perspective from it. Like, for me, it's about building resilience against misinformation, but I guess different people take something different from the game.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if I answered all of that question though. Was there an aspect that I didn't?
Yeah, there are other questions, but I think what you're saying, I mean, it's very important to tailor the messages to different audiences, and that would be, I would assume, the next step, not only in terms of age, but a variety of other demographics or cognitive abilities, etc. So Daniel asks, for your research, do you look into the past and how people handled misinformation to help find ways to deal with misinformation today?
That's a good question. So there is a lot of research into tackling misinformation across a lot of different topics. I think in terms of inoculation theory, that began more as political, inoculating against political misinformation. And it's only really been over the last 5-10 years that it's started to more narrowly focus on science misinformation, inoculating against science misinformation. So there is a lot of work that we can draw on in other topics, mainly health misinformation and political misinformation. And the general principles of inoculation are quite universal. So we're finding that they do also work, in different areas of science misinformation. Yeah. So I think that answers the question, but yeah, there's inoculation theory dates back to the 1950s. So there's many decades of research testing this approach.
Myra says, Dr. Cook, your approach is so creative. And then she asks, for your challenge number 1, can't you leverage your same approach to explain why deniers or misinformation folks want to keep you, quote unquote, stupid, ignorant, misinformed, to augment the awesome job you've done explaining how denial techniques work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I talked about 2 types of inoculation, fact-based and logic-based, but there is a third type that I didn't touch on, source-based inoculation, which involves essentially discrediting sources of misinformation by either explaining the motives on why people would want to misinform, or exposing, I guess, their lack of credibility as being an information source. And I've tended to not focus on that. Just those different experiments that I described just gradually funneled me more towards logic-based inoculation, and seeing that as kind of a powerful approach, because fact-based and source-based are very narrow in scope. If you inoculate people against a particular type of misinformation using either fact or source-based, it's only applicable in that specific context. It will only work against that specific source or against information targeting a specific fact. But with logic-based inoculation, what I found is you explain that technique in one context and it can apply across all contexts. And so it's more like a universal vaccine against misinformation. So yes, I think that the source-based approach is effective. There hasn't been that much research into it, but what has been done has shown that it's an effective approach. And I don't think it's as broadly applicable as logic-based, but I think that the 3 approaches can complement each other.
Thank you. So Dr. Nancy Stephan Floor asks, regarding climate change in particular, how does your research address the body of research that suggests that repeating misinformation, even in the process of refuting it, tends to spread or reinforce the information?
Yeah, I kind of almost reluctantly mentioned the backfire effect earlier in my talk. There's been a lot of concern about debunking myths causing potential backfire effects and actually reinforcing the myths. But over the last decade, a lot of research has tried to replicate and identify backfire effects and when they happen. And most efforts to replicate a backfire effect has failed. They've failed to actually find an effect. It only works in a handful of kind of contexts. And so last year we published the Debunking Handbook 2020, which was a summary of all the psychological research into debunking. And basically on the topic of backfire effects and this question, we conclude that backfire effects are not the boogeyman that people once or still even think that they are, that they happen very rarely. and while we should practice best practices in how we debunk misinformation, we shouldn't let the fear of a potential backfire dissuade us from engaging with misinformation. The greater danger is that we leave misinformation unchallenged.
Thank you. Rima Dadalos asks, are there any other fields you think that this game format addressing misinformation could be applied to?
Yes, all of them. Basically, like I started with climate misinformation being my focus. Then through 2020, I saw that all the same denial techniques that I was explaining and inoculating against in climate misinformation were repeating themselves in COVID misinformation. So I started doing a series of videos on my YouTube channel, looking at fallacies, the same fallacies in all the COVID myths that were just sweeping the media landscape, or often coming out of the White House at the time. And then that really kind of broadened my perspective, and at the same time I was developing the game, and I saw that the game was really effective against all forms of science misinformation. And so even though the DNA of the game came from climate misinformation, so there is a heavy climate emphasis, really I'm trying to put as much of all different topics, whether it's evolution versus creationism, or anti-vax misinformation, or COVID, or climate change, or flat earthism, or the moon landing being a hoax, or just now conspiracy theories. Like, I'm tossing whether to put some of the election hoax conspiracy theories in there. And my main reason for pause is because it'll date too quickly, and it's very local, and the game's being played all over the world. So I'm struggling with that tension of how specific to be, to US based misinformation. There's a lot of US stuff in there, but I want to try to make it as broadly applicable as well. So, but the answer is denial techniques are seen in all topics, and again, learning them builds your resilience in all areas. And one last thing I'll say is, what surprised me about all those teachers signing up from the 51 states across the US, most of them are science-based, or environmental science, or climate change. But what has surprised me is seeing also English teachers, geography, history, math, philosophy, psychology, a whole range of different subjects interested in using this game to teach critical thinking. And so I think it's really made me realize the game is currently, there's teachers interested from grade 6 to grad school across all these different subjects. So it's having critical thinking games seems to be very universal and universally needed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thinking about COVID, I wonder if you're thinking about messaging, not only around COVID itself and the misinformation around COVID, but also messaging around the vaccine, including sort of ways to encourage people to get the vaccine, and perhaps the need to tailor, right, that message for different populations. So I think messaging, at least here in New York, that I often hear is we need to get shots in the arm. And I'm not quite sure that kind of expression is the best way to encourage a number of folks to get the vaccine. It may work for some, but not others.
Yeah, so I think it was just at the start of January, we published a handbook, the COVID-19 Vaccination Communication Handbook. The short URL would be sks.to/C19vax, VAX. I might type it into the chat. But the idea of this was basically to summarize the research into how to communicate about vaccination. But we also included in it how to respond to COVID, not both COVID-19 vaccination myths, but also just vaccination myths in general. And to do that, we drew on the the critical thinking work that I've been doing, explaining the fallacies in each of the most common myths about vaccination.
We have another question. Athanasios Mazarakis. Hi, Athanasios. He said, great, interesting presentation. Thank you. An ethical aspect or question. What if, for example, supporters of conspiracy theories use a similar identical game, yep, to spread their own views and would be more successful? Is there a quote unquote safety mechanism in your research that looks at this ethical aspect?
Yeah, there's been a couple of interesting articles over the last few months, kind of hypothesizing that conspiracy theories like QAnon had a real game element to them, that the things that make games attractive to people, those same elements are also seen in QAnon. It's about kind of solving mysteries and investigating and joining the dots and solving puzzles, really. Even though the puzzles they're solving are these imaginary puzzles, but they feel real to the people. They'll see these two random things and join a dot and think that they've uncovered this hidden connection. And so it's kind of like a game. So I think that is already happening, that even if it's spontaneous, there is an element of gamification that entices people to kind of go down the QAnon rabbit hole. As for my game and like, is there a problematic element to explaining the techniques of denial? I think the answer to that is that in order to build resilience against misinformation, you need to explain the techniques that can be used against you to mislead you. It's kind of like learning how a magician performs their trick. What is the sleight of hand trick that they use to basically trick people into thinking that they've performed magic? Or someone who cheats at cards, what is the technique that they use? How can you spot that? You need to understand those techniques. And you could, the method that you explain the technique, it could be, them just listening to a professor give a lecture explaining the techniques, and I have done that. Or it can be an interactive game. The means of explaining it can vary, but ultimately you're still explaining those techniques of denial. So I don't think that the platform of the game is inherently problematic. It's just another way of conveying information to people. In this case, explanations of denial techniques. I'm still working through this myself, so I'm not sure if that completely answers the question, but yeah, it's a good question.
Okay, well, it looks like we have 1 minute left. Dr. Cook, I want to thank you so much for this fascinating lecture and responding to the questions so wonderfully. And you're, again, our first seminar speaker for the spring semester, so appreciate that. Our next seminar is Wednesday, February 17th at 11 o'clock, and we're going to have Dr. Karen Douglas from the University of Kent in the United Kingdom talking about the psychology of conspiracy theories. So there's certainly an overlap, I think, with your research, Dr. Cook. You could register at the Eventbrite link that you should have at this point. In addition, you may find interesting videos that have been uploaded to a YouTube channel called the Cyber Psychology Center. And these were videos of webinars from last semester. So again, thank you. You've provided your information if folks want to get in touch with you, Dr. Cook, and I want to get in touch with you again and talk about some ideas, some overlapping ideas. So thank you very much again, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.